Mehlaqa Samdani. Welcome to another episode of Critical Conversations, where we discuss hot topic issues related to Muslim communities and other minority groups. Today, our focus of conversation is going to be the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. Earlier this year, President Trump signed an executive order to keep the military facility open. And since it was established in 2002, there have been more than 779 people who have served time at the military prison. And over its 16-year period, more than 730 have been released without ever being charged with a crime. To understand the history and legality of the prison and to talk about the future of the current inmates there, which number about 41, we are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Buzz Eisenberg, who is a Northampton-based attorney who over a 12-year period represented 8 Guantanamo detainees, all of whom have since been released. Mr. Buzz Eisenberg, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure.
Before I start, let me give a brief introduction of your background. As a Franklin County attorney for 38 years, Buzz has handled a wide variety of civil, criminal, and civil rights cases in the local, regional, and international arenas. Among his many recognitions are the Massachusetts Bar Association Pro Bono Publico Award, the Southern Center for Human Rights Frederick Douglass Human Rights Award, the Boston Bar Association's President's Award, and the National Legal Aid and Defenders Beacon of Justice Award. Buzz has also been given the Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty Award for his successful representation of Georgia death row inmate Kenneth B. Blanks, and an award Western Mass Legal Services for 25 years of service on its board of directors, including as its president. Buzz is now in his 9th year as president of the International Justice Network. Buzz, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor to have you here.
It's my pleasure. My mother would have loved that introduction.
I am sure she has a lot to be proud of. So, Buzz, I would like to sort of begin by learning a little bit about how you got involved with Guantanamo detainees and what drew you to this work and why is it important for you?
Sure. In 2004, a long time ago now, it doesn't feel like it should be, but Guantanamo was an affront to anybody who took an oath as an attorney to preserve and protect the Constitution and had to watch as due process was so overdue and people were abused and tortured in the name of our government. And I wanted to volunteer. What happened in 2004 is the government had taken the position that Guantanamo, being on Cuban soil, was in a place where the U.S. courts had no jurisdiction. So some very courageous, a few lawyers came in and litigated that, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of habeas jurisdiction. And when I read that, I volunteered in November of 2004. I was sort of the second wave of lawyers who volunteered, and I think there were about 70 of us then who jumped on board and had my first client who was released the next June of 2006, was transferred back to Saudi Arabia, and by then I just kept taking another one and another one until I totaled 8.
Wow. And so you've hinted that at it a little bit, but for the benefit of our audience, can you tell us what the difference is between the military facility at Guantanamo and civilian prisons here in the U.S.?
Yeah, the Constitution. Civilian prisons hold people who are charged. They're entitled to due process rights and Fifth and Sixth Amendment privileges and rights that are guaranteed to them. The ones at Guantanamo are held, in my view, lawlessly, in violation of both U.S. and international law. That's one difference. Another difference is the cost. That the Guantanamo costs about $445 million a year, according to the Defense Department's own numbers. Wow. About $29,000 per night per detainee. Wow. And a federal inmate, it's about $40,000 a year. That's a difference. And the other thing is, our with very few exceptions, there isn't lawful torture in what we call the Article 3 courts, the ones in regular federal prison. But Guantanamo has been replete with, just rife with, abuse of inmates over the, how many years now do we have? Since
16.
2002, 16 years
Yes.
of Guantanamo. Every one of the 41 that are still remaining there have been abused. That's a huge difference as well.
Sure. So U.S. laws don't apply, but what about the Geneva Conventions?
Right. Under international law, all the Geneva Conventions, all 4 of them, has common Article 3, which people famously know by, sort of like Miranda rights. People know about Miranda rights. Well, people know that all you have to give is your name, rank, and serial number. But the CIA, British authorities, and others did not respect that common Article 3. That's what torture is. They interrogated and forced people to answer questions in ways that couldn't be done under federal law. The common Article 3 guarantees fair treatment in the wake of World War II, the Geneva Conventions, all argue that you have to barracks prisoners of war in the same barracks of the same condition that you house your own military and medical and feeding and clothing, and all of those things are guaranteed under Geneva to be habitable and fair treatment. But Guantanamo is anything but that.
Right, right. And so one of the last detainees that you directly represented was Mohammed Abdullah Matan, a 35-year-old Palestinian. Can you talk a little bit about him and how he ended up over there and what was his treatment like?
Yeah, Matan came from the West Bank, came from a family that was poor. His father had multiple wives, which is obviously lawful there. So he had 16 siblings, total of 17 of them, and they didn't have much money. So he went off in an organization to study Islam. His goal was to become an imam. He ended up in Pakistan and then Afghanistan, then back to Pakistan, and while there was sold on a bounty to Pakistani police, who eventually sold him to U.S. military. He was taken to Kandahar, I think, no, Bagram, where he was interrogated.
In Afghanistan.
Abused.
Yeah.
And yes, in Afghanistan, a military base. It also became a detention center. There were 2 principal detention centers in Afghanistan. And then brought to Guantanamo, where I think he was brought there in February of 2002. And it never did anything to warrant his being, he was just caught on a bounty. So many, for your viewers, so many of these men, I think 86%, according to the Department of Defense, not according to us, 86% of them were there as a result of a bounty paid. So what the U.S. did was, and its allies, the Allied forces did, but where do we find these terrorists? Well, how about if we offer a bounty for anybody who turns someone in? So what happened in Afghanistan at the time was the 3rd poorest country on the planet per capita, as you probably know. And so these villagers would see somebody who was a Saudi. One man that I met was there. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is to do charitable work.
Sure.
So he was there trying to do medical work, but he dressed like a Saudi, which is different than how they dressed in Afghanistan. So he was turned in by a villager who was paid the equivalent of $4,600 US, which is like
a lot of money.
Like a lot of money for that poor country, probably about 13 years worth of pay. Of course, actually that wasn't true in his case. What was often the case is the villager turned him into what was then the Northern Alliance, what we call warlords, and these tribal leaders would turn him over to the U.S. and get the money. So the villagers never even saw the money. And so that's a very common story. That's what happened to Matan. And then he was held in Guantanamo until, I can't even remember, I'm going to say 2015, when he went to Uruguay, I think.
Wow, so 13 years he was at Guantanamo without ever being charged with anything.
Well, most of the men there have never been charged with anything. There's more men have died in the Guantanamo prison camps than have ever been convicted of anything. There were 8 convictions, 4 of them were reversed.
Wow.
But 9 people have died at Guantanamo. But the vast majority were never charged with anything.
Wow.
To this day, even of the 41, I think 16 of them were charged, and 4 of those charges were reversed. So I think it's like about a dozen of the 41 who have even been charged with anything. It's an indefinite detention. The government calls them forever prisoners.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, so as you said, he was sent back to Uruguay, and some of the other detainees that you were involved in getting released, I think 6 out of 8 of them were also sent to Uruguay. Now, why were they not sent back to their countries of origin?
Well, I have to correct that fact. He's the only one. There was a group of 6. We worked on a team, but that went to Uruguay. I only directly represented Matan in that group, although we all helped each other with it, with everything. So some of them, I had 4 Algerians. They were all sent back to Algeria. I had 1 Syrian who was sent to Algeria. I had 2 Saudis. They were sent to Saudi Arabia. So most of them were repatriated to their home country.
And the ones who weren't, do you know why they were not?
Well, the Palestinians at Guantanamo, obviously Israel has control over that region, and they would not let somebody who was held at Guantanamo, the fear being, even if they didn't do anything wrong, they're really angry now after being held at Guantanamo.
Yeah.
So Israel wouldn't allow any of the Palestinians to return, so there had to be other countries that were willing to have them transferred to their country. There were the Yemenis are a big problem. In Yemen, there's an active civil war going on all the time, and so the U.S. wouldn't transfer to Yemen because it was such a volatile environment there, so they found other places for them. The Chinese, there's a small minority in the western portion of China. China wouldn't accept them back because they're Muslims. China oppresses Muslims.
Sure.
And so we found other places like Albania and even Bermuda, strange places.
Yeah, sure.
Palau, that the U.S. paid those countries $1 million a head or something like that in order to accept them. So it all is based on the geopolitical situation in the particular country, whether they get repatriated or sent to a third party.
Now, considering that a lot of them were never charged, were held there were held in detention for a very, very long period of time, were they ever compensated? Were there any reparations made to these people for the wrong that had been done to them?
Capital N, no. And it didn't matter how much we advocated for that. The United States was never going to do that, and it didn't do that. The monies that it paid out were to third-party countries, as I just described, in order to induce them to take. So a country like Albania took 5 of these men, and Palau took 3 of these men. You know, we were paying countries that needed liquidity to take these men, but these men were never paid reparations. And some of them really suffered. They ended up including the Uruguayans. They, what do? You go to another country, speak Spanish, and you know your native tongue is Arabic, or a lot of these men, their native tongues were Pashto, and there they were, sometimes without an apartment, without a job, didn't speak the language, and some of them had wives and children and parents and family in their home country that they couldn't see anymore.
Wow. And were they ever able to get back in touch with their families? Did the families know that they had been, taken to Guantanamo Bay and then released?
Yeah, in the beginning the answer was no.
Yeah.
We didn't even know names when I first started. We just knew what's called ISN, their internment serial numbers. But then eventually we found out their names, and then the International Committee, the Red Cross, came in, and every once in a while they could have a conversation with a loved one. But everything is classified down there, so even letters didn't get through to them. That their families, once they found out they were in Guantanamo and they got the address, they weren't being delivered to them. For the most part, that ended on the habeas side. There's a bifurcation we haven't talked about between those that are being tried by what we call a military commission and habeas corpus, which is a sort of a civil remedy for those people who were captured. I was a habeas lawyer, not a commissioned lawyer.
Okay, and so sort of talking about that, I mean, since 9/11, there have been 578 terrorism-related cases that have been tried in U.S. federal courts, and only 7 that have been completed by military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. So why
Most of those by guilty plea, by the way, not by a verdict.
Sure. Yeah. And so, but why can't these prisoners be tried in U.S. courts?
Because of Congress. And, well, under the Bush administration, they took the same position the Trump administration takes. The Obama administration wanted to try them in federal courts, wanted to transfer them to a maximum security prison, a supermax, they call it, in Thompson, Illinois, or in Colorado, or in the Brig in South Carolina. But Congress wouldn't let that happen. What Congress did was attach to, without getting too detailed here, to the Defense Authorization Act.
Yes.
A prohibition against ever bringing them to the United States and trying them in federal court.
I see.
The theory being, that they might win, and what would come out at trial would be dreadful because we'd hear the truth about what happened in Guantanamo. And B, that somehow those locations would become targets of terror. That was the ostensible reason that was often used. But Congress forbid it. Since 2011, every defense authorization which funds the military, you can't fund the military without authorization and appropriation by Congress.
Yeah.
And it was always called the McCain Amendment, Senator McCain, and Senator Grant always sponsored it, and it was attached to those appropriations.
Interesting. And so
But I do want to point out, all those federal cases that you talked about, the vast majority of them were guilty findings.
Wow.
So what we call the Article III courts, our real federal courts, have been highly successful in prosecuting and convicting terror cases. So
because initially, I mean, I thought that they had also come up with this argument sort of against, taking people to federal courts, was that it's so difficult to present the evidence and to convict people. But that obviously has not been the case.
Well, it wasn't the case, harkening back to our first question here, because your classic criminal case involves someone who hasn't been tortured. So a lot of the evidence that was procured by the military was the product of torture. And so the fear has always been that would be ruled inadmissible in a real court of law.
Sure.
Which probably is the case in most of these cases, or many of these cases. But the problem is that suggests that you don't really believe in our innocent until proven guilty, the protections, the famous cases, Mississippi versus Green, that says you can't torture somebody that you're holding. If you believe that that's the right law, then in fact the courts should rule that way, and the evidence you procured by torture, overt torture or a more subtle brand of torture, keeping somebody in 45 degrees who comes from a sand climate, playing loud rock and roll music for 72 hours before you interrogate them, depriving them of water, making them be naked in a cell, taking their prayer rug so that they don't use it to keep themselves warm. Those should be condemned by a court. Those should be ruled, the evidence is procured as a result should be ruled inadmissible. So that's the theory.
Wow. So the Obama administration and Obama himself had made a huge pledge to shut down Guantanamo. So what happened? Why was he unable to do that? Congress
would not allow it, and so what? Year after year, the Obama administration tried to close Guantanamo and created a special envoy in the Department of State and in the military in order to figure out what to do with these. But Congress would thwart it over and over and over again. Obama wanted to close it, but part of that, for those of us who are involved in on the habeas side of things, that's just geography. Whether you deprive somebody of their due process in a supermax in Illinois or in a Cuban supermax, it's just geography.
So what you're referring to here is, I think President Obama had floated this idea of transferring them to supermaximum facilities on U.S. soil.
That's right. And President Obama also, he did an analysis of every single case from the time he first took office in January 2009. it was his second executive order, was to create this review team, Guantanamo Bay Review Task Force, which was populated by 9 of the 15 cabinet level departments, intelligence, defense, state, etc. And they reviewed every single case. There were still some that he wanted to hold indefinitely for the reasons I just said, because the courts would rule inadmissible a lot of the evidence that they procured. So even then we had a lot of problems with Obama's position. However, the overt torture sort of stopped under the Obama administration. I will say that is true. And he did want to close this dreadful prison camp.
Yeah. So, critics who oppose shutting down the facility sort of point to recidivism as one of the reasons for not shutting it down, that people who are released will return to militant movements and militant groups. And indeed, some of that has occurred among some of those who were released, among the 730 perhaps. I don't know the exact number, but there was a small number that have returned. So what do you think, how would you respond to that? And then what do you think should happen to the 41 who remain?
Well, the first thing I'd like your viewers to do is to go to the Department, either the Department of Defense website, or if they want a summary of it, they could go to the Seton Hall University Studies. There are a series of studies that were, groups of students under the supervision of professors did exhaustive studies of information that was on the Department of Defense website. And this is what you'll learn. Only 5% of the men at Guantanamo were ever on the battlefield, according to the Department of Defense. The bounty program I talked about earlier explains part of that. But, so when we talk about recidivism, returning to the battlefield, you're talking about 5%, and the majority of that 5% are the ones who are still there. The ones who were released and transferred were not among those on the battlefield. They were just dreadful, horrific, politicized kidnappings.
At the wrong place at the wrong time.
Wrong place, wrong guys.
Right.
Wrong guys.
Right.
And so that's the first thing. I just want to sort of, because the question suggests that they were on the battlefield in the first place.
Sure. So they weren't enemy combatants at all.
Well, that's a funny term that we can talk about as well.
Sure.
Because that's an invented term, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But those who we had, I can't remember the year anymore, I'm getting too old, but I'm going to say in 2010 or something like that, the Pentagon issued a list called the Dirty 30. That's what they called it. They said there were 30 people who went to and did bad things after being transferred from Guantanamo. So we took a whole bunch of, actually, I can't take credit for it, my colleagues and Seton Hall did a real study of those men, and we found out that number one thing that they found out was somebody who was said to have been a suicide bomber was in the university at Albania at the time. And in fact, if he was a suicide bomber, he couldn't be an enrolled student matriculated in the university.
Right.
So the other thing is this terrible sort of ethnocentric thing that we do with Arabic names and other names.
Sure.
That, how many Mohammeds, how many people Muslims name their child Mohammed or Abdullah, servant of God, or, and when they would transliterate these names, they kept getting the wrong guys. And so the guys that they were saying had been in Guantanamo often weren't in Guantanamo. There are some cases, famously Yosef al-Shahiri and others who were released from Afghanistan. He had never been on the battlefield. From Guantanamo. After Guantanamo, he then joined the fray. And
so your theory is that he became radicalized while he was at Guantanamo.
Yeah, we did a great job of that. It was like, terror college. It's if you didn't hate the U.S. before, go to Guantanamo for a number of years and see what happens. So, my response is that it just doesn't happen as often as the Pentagon says that it happened. And on those occasions when it did happen, a lot of it we created.
Sure. So what will be the implications of Trump's executive order in terms of keeping the facility open? In the latter years of the Bush administration and then during the Obama administration, that population of Guantanamo had gotten down, considerably. So what are we going to see with the 41 who are still there? Is their release going to be slowed down? And are we going to see the population rise again?
I don't know who knows what the Trump administration is going to do. The president says that he wants to repopulate Guantanamo, and we'll see whether or not that does in fact happen. I think what's happened at Guantanamo, when we first started, people may recall that when Guantanamo opened on January 11th of 2002 as a detention center, those kennels that you might have seen pictures of with the orange jumpsuits and the black hoods over their heads, and they were kept in basically, cages with a sheltered roof so they didn't get rained on in the rear or sun. And other than that, that's what it was. That was called Camp X-Ray. They then created these huts called wooden huts, Camp Echo. And eventually they built these two Supermaxes, 5 and 6. They've closed 5. Camp 6, which I think is built for about 350 people, now houses 20.
Okay.
And then there's Camp 7, which is those are what we call the high-value detainees, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the people that we think were the guys that the U.S. was looking for in the first place. But that's a super secret camp. I've never been to that camp. So there's this huge staff that surrounds and patrols and takes care of the detention center that, as I said before, it's about $445 million a year, according to the General Accounting Office. So President Trump wants to use that facility in order to grab people and take them there. But he's talked about people who are involved in the drug trade. He's talking about anybody he doesn't like, anybody depriving them of due process and sending them to Guantanamo based on either charges. The problem with Guantanamo is that they don't charge you.
Right. But even American citizens, is he considering?
We haven't had that yet.
Yeah.
And he hasn't actually said that, but he's talked about drug traffickers. Well, I don't know what he has in mind. It's whatever it is. It's inane. It's unconstitutional, and it runs contrary to the oath that he took.
Sure. So, Buzz,
to preserve and protect the Constitution.
Right. And so, nearing the end of our program, but what would you like the American population to know about what's happening at Guantanamo, and why should it matter to them, and what can they do about it?
It should matter to them because it's their country. The things that are being done, even just holding people, sending them to Cuba in order to serve time, they should care about that because it runs to the heart of who we are and what our aspirations are as U.S. citizens. I'd like them to remain. There's so much craziness in the world now and so much craziness in this country, in this administration, that it's off the front pages.
Right.
There was a time when it was emblematic of all that was going on in the Bush administration and in the wake of 9/11. Well, it's now sort of silently just sitting there, and these people are suffering a lack of due process. And so I think there are sites. There's a wonderful site, Nancy Talanian, right here in the Pioneer Valley, longtime activist, former executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. She has created No More Guantanamos. That organization has been in, I'm going to say, 7-8 years at least. And you can sign up for their newsletter and see what's happening and track individuals or track what's happening with the base in general. It's called No More Guantanamos. If you Google No More Guantanamos, you'll see that site, and you can get a newsletter every week for free that keeps you in touch. The Center for Constitutional Rights has been our sort of, in New York, has been sort of our headquarters for all of the Guantanamo attorneys who have worked on this, and the center is CCR. It's an extraordinary resource for information about what's going on in Guantanamo. The answer to your question is I would like people to pay attention.
Sure.
It's being done in your name, in my name. And it's dreadful. If you believe that we are a country that reveres freedom, then indefinitely holding people without ever charging them, without ever trying them, depriving them of every right that you were taught to believe in fourth grade is it's shameful. It's a stain on who each of us are as citizens. And regardless of what you think about the war on terror and those who commit it, it's not the way that people should be treated ever in our name.
Bas, thank you so much. It's been a real honor to talk to you, and thank you for everything that you've done to uphold the Constitution and sort of raise our awareness about the rule of law and democratic norms in this country.
Thank you for making it an issue that keep it in people's mind.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for joining us. Until next time, this is your host, Mehlaqa Samdani.